Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves for the Nintendo Entertainment System offers a distinct take on a licensed tie-in game, especially in 1991. The way it handles the licenses involved, along with the gameplay style, or perhaps styles might be better, that it uses, make it stand out from the crowd of movie tie-in games on the NES. This is Morgan IP Fics, scribe and director of the Silver Screen, guest narrating for Makopowered. Welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not classics or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing, despite themselves. Unlike with the discussion of Small Soldiers in the last video, Robin Hood Prince of Thieves does not approach its license with any sort of transmedia storytelling or clever metatextual design ideas. Just like with Small Soldiers, however, it is important to discuss the film the game is based on, but for different reasons. The game was heralded, not for expanding the lore of the film, but for closely adhering to the story from the film. Nintendo Power featured it as the cover story for their July 1991 issue, in which they claimed that the game made the player feel like they were in the movie. This, well, it's not exactly accurate. Now, don't get me wrong here. Personally, it's one of my favorites of the NES era, but how it deviates from the movie? Well, we'll get into that. A quick aside before we get started. Can we talk for a moment about how the Nintendo Power writer who worked on said cover story felt that, as an NES game, Robin Hood Prince of Thieves unfolding its story clearly and logically made the game stand out? I mean, yeah, it does have a good through line, and it does get most of the major story beats of the film right, and in the right order, but it had also come out after games like Dragon Warrior, Final Fantasy, and Ninja Gaiden, all of which were heralded for their storytelling. So, in all honesty, I'm puzzled, and not too sure why the Nintendo Power writer felt the need to point out the game's unfolding story. But it does feel odd, out of place. But anyway, let's talk a bit about the film before getting down to the nitty-gritty of things. Robin Hood Prince of Thieves the movie is a 1991 take on the Robin Hood legend, directed by Kevin Reynolds, who you might know from... Wait a second. Seriously? And we're sure on this. Okay then. Who you might also know from Waterworld. Yeah, at least the postman is in his credits as well, I guess. Sorry, where was I? Right. So, Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, the movie. Let's call it an Americanized take on the Robin Hood legend, as evidenced by the merry outlaw being played by Kevin Costner with an American instead of British accent. The supporting cast of the film also had some definite heavy hitters, including Morgan Freeman, Christian Slater, Michael Wincott, and stealing every scene he's in, Alan Rickman. Oh, and Sean Connery in a cameo that acknowledges that time he played Robin Hood in the 1970s. As expected, the film recounts the conflict between the corrupt Sheriff of Nottingham and Robin of Locksley. What's unexpected is how the film approaches that conflict. Gone is Prince John, brother to King Richard, who was off fighting in the Crusades. Gone as well as the famous archery contest that Robin wins under Prince John's nose. Instead, the sheriff is the one shown as taking advantage of the power vacuum left by Richard's absence. Speaking of the Crusades, the film addresses them directly, starting with Robin and his boyhood friend Peter locked up and tortured in a Jerusalem dungeon. Robin escapes with Azim, Morgan Freeman's character, and then discovers that the Sheriff of Nottingham, Alan Rickman, has killed his father and taken his lands. Robin then reconnects with Marion, Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio, and becomes an outlaw when he is denied his birthright. Adventure, with glorious Alan Rickman ad-libs in every scene graced with his presence, ensues. As mentioned previously, the film was an astounding success, becoming the number 2 grossing film of the year behind Terminator 2. I mean, if you're going to come in second to any movie, Terminator 2 is nothing to slough at. A very tough act to follow. Robin Hood Prince of Thieves outgrossed movies like Disney's Beauty and the Beast, Hook, and Silence of the Lambs. Can we just take a moment here to acknowledge just how good of a year 1991 was for Hollywood films? So, yeah, it was definitely among good company that year. And because of that, a video game was almost inevitable. As a matter of fact, the only movie from the list of top 5 that didn't get at least one game was Silence of the Lambs, which, honestly, I would have loved to see an NES game. Like, come on, if Platoon and Gilligan's Island can get their own NES games, surely Silence of the Lambs could have as well. But I've digressed here. We're supposed to be talking about the NES game, not my obsession with Hollywood cinema. So let's get back to the matter of hand, shall we? In all honesty, it would have been easy enough for the game developers to have taken Robin Hood Prince of Thieves and made a standard side-scroller with a combination of close and long-range combat. Sunsoft did it with Batman in 1990, and the game didn't even come close to adhering to the film's plot or even its aesthetic, aside from the first and last levels. Even Terminator 2, the film Prince of Thieves played second fiddle to that year, went the safe side-scroller route when LJN got their hands on it. Instead of doing this, though, Sculptured Software took Prince of Thieves and made it into a full-on action RPG, one that has more than a few PC RPG influences. This alone is surprising because Sculptured Software has a spotty record with releases. On the one hand, they are responsible for the Super Star Wars series, the excellent Super NES port of Mortal Kombat 2, and even ambitious games like NCAA Basketball, NHL Stanley Cup, and the SNES port of Doom, all three of which may get their own weekend rental episodes at some point. On the other hand, they are also responsible for games like the terrible SNES port of the original Mortal Kombat and WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, and licensed poorly executed Simpsons games like Bart's Nightmare and Virtual Bart. In all honesty here, the bad stuff is not entirely Sculptured Software's fault though. All of those games were developed for Acclaim/LJN, which was notorious for unreasonable deadlines for licensed games, which caused quality to fall by the wayside in favor of quick profits. This got worse for Sculptured Software when Acclaim bought the studio in 1995. But getting back to Robin Hood, the actual subject of this video. While it was a licensed game developed to coincide with the movie's release or shortly thereafter, it was not developed under Acclaim's directive. Virgin Games was at the helm this time around, and it looks like they gave the developers more freedom to get it right than Acclaim would have. Now, the game definitely has its issues, but it's also nowhere near the nightmare level of, well, Bart's Nightmare. For instance, the movement for the standard overhead gameplay feels actually kind of hard to describe. It feels a bit like the player is controlling Robin using a trackball, except without the precision of actually using a trackball. Actually, maybe it's more accurate to say that the movement feels like it's somewhere in between using a trackball and using an old school mouse. Now, this may be tied to some of them more PC RPG elements in the game. However, playing with the NES controller D-pad causes so many instances where Robin just bounces against objects in the environment not once, but multiple times. This is compounded by the fact that the developers treated any visible part of the structure or object as a physical obstacle to Robin's movement. Tallest spire in a tower? You need to walk around that because it will absolutely block your path while on the ground. The archway you're walking through is angled because of the perspective of the building. You better believe you're walking diagonally to get past it. On the ground in the forest and there are treetops nearby? Yeah, those treetops are in your way. Because of this, you can get slaughtered in combat, which can be a major problem. The player only gets 2 continues, and then it's game over. There's also a vestigial interaction menu, which the player uses when the developers remember it's there, I guess? I mean, there's a search function, but you really only need it at the very beginning of the game to find the hidden passage out of the dungeon. Well, okay, you can use it to search enemies' corpses for items, but half the time that's not necessary either. There's a talk function, but it's largely superfluous outside of just a few instances because Robin will talk with people just by running into them. There's a take option, but that is completely unnecessary since pressing the attack button near an item will automatically pick it up. The interaction menu feels more like something the developers tossed in because the Dungeons & Dragons games on PC had it, Dragon Quest/Warrior had it, and so it was expected. Also, and this isn't really a hindrance to the game, quite the opposite in fact, but the quarterstaff is way too overpowered. I mean, look at this. This giant boar is supposed to be a challenging boss fight, but here, I'm just standing and holding the B button and utterly destroying it in a matter of seconds. The game does balance this out a little by throwing enemies who fire arrows at the player, but for most, if not all, of the regular rank-and-file melee enemies, the quarterstaff just feels like God mode. Speaking of gameplay balance issues, let's talk about the side view sword fighting sections of the game. In theory, these should be really cool. Leap around, cross swords with skilled enemies, and in general, evoke the feel of the climactic sword fighting of the movie. The Errol Flynn, Basil Rathbone style swashbuckling associated with the Robin Hood character. In practice, however, for one thing, there are no defensive moves with the sword. Yes, Robin can duck, roll, and jump, but there are no defensive blocking moves with the sword itself, something your opponents can definitely do. There are also no parries, and there is only one level of sword swing that Robin can perform. Lastly, the health bars are far too long for people getting hit with sharpened blades. These elements make the sword fights less cinematic and more tedious. Bushido Blade, this is not. But here's the thing, despite these issues, Robin Hood Prince of Thieves offers a fascinating approach to experiencing the events of the movie. The opening of the game is of particular interest not only for the way it mirrors the opening of the movie, but also for how it prepares the player for the rest of the game. Just as with the movie, the game opens in the dungeon in Jerusalem, where Robin, Peter, and Azim are being held. In quick order, the player is introduced to the overhead combat system when freeing Peter, the menu system when finding the hidden key Azim provides, the side view sword fighting in the battle with the axe-wielding executioner, and the zoomed-out melee battles in the sewers beneath the dungeon. The only gameplay mode the opening doesn't prepare the player for is the side view horse riding sequence that pops up twice in the game, and that's just because it wouldn't be in keeping with the scene from the movie. In other words, the opening of the game introduces the player to almost all of the gameplay styles encountered throughout, while staying true to the movie as well. The game also stays true to the story and character beats of the movie, but it uses gameplay instead of just cutscenes. Take this, for example, where Robin is supposed to enter Dubois Manor to meet with Marion for the first time. I kept trying to enter the manor, but the guard would not let me in, and I couldn't figure out why. I then clicked the character menu and realized that Robin needed to be holding the ring Peter gave him at the beginning of the game before dying. It's a small touch, but a nice one nonetheless. Speaking of that character menu, let's discuss that for a moment, because there are a few things going on here. First, it is very PC RPG inspired, complete with aspects that just don't get used. For instance, all the characters have a spot to put on leg armor / new pants / who knows what. I can't say what's supposed to have gone there because nothing in the game actually does. I'm also not sure why all the characters have weight limits and limited inventory space. I mean, there's no way the player is going to hit both caps, and more likely than not, will just hit the limited space cap each time. It is a nice touch, though, that Little John can carry more weight than any of the other characters, since he is the largest and strongest man in the movie, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall to Kevin Costner's 6 feet. As well, there are other little character touches in the menu. Duncan is a key example of this. Since he's been blinded, having him look at objects doesn't work. The game gently chides the player with a reminder of Duncan's loss of sight. These touches actually do a good job of character building that are more than just gain experience points, level up, although that's here too. It's just a shame that the developers couldn't see their way to making Azim's character icons in the menu, well, not white. The game takes the character building via gameplay in the menu and expands it to community building in the larger game experience. After Robin and party make their way to Sherwood, the linear progression of the story gives way to a series of missions, some connected, some not, which don't necessarily progress the main narrative. Instead, these missions illustrate how this outlaw community interacts and grows over time, as well as building Robin's legend. In between each mission, I don't know, maybe we should be calling them quests, given the medieval milieu? In between each quest, the game shows how the forest community is literally growing, with more tree huts and walkways being built over time. Basically, what we got as a brief montage in the movie is expanded to encompass the whole middle of the game. This is actually a really nice touch to the storytelling elements of the game that expands on the world of the film. Now, let's be clear about a few things here. This is not an ActRaiser style experience where the player is actively building the community before going out to fight for it. The player has no hand in the actual construction of the forest sanctuary, they just get to see its growth in between quests. Also, while some of the quests absolutely fit into the style and storytelling of the movie, some most definitely do not. In terms of quests that do fit in with the movie's story, the developers added an entire subplot where a corrupt baron sides with the sheriff, and Robin and his band dismantle his plans, from preventing his forced marriage for land rights purposes to stopping him from raiding a village and putting an end to his evil schemes. The confrontations with the Baron are essentially a microcosm of the conflict between Robin and the sheriff, and acts as a nice parallel storyline that represents how Robin fights for the people. Then there are quests about convincing a weapons master to help train Robin's band, and actually robbing from the rich to give to the poor, which is where Friar Tuck gets added to Robin's party and Guy of Gisborne meets his fate. Again, good storytelling, expanding the montage from the movie and making the player feel like a heroic outlaw. Some of the quests, though, some of them are distinctly odd, and one of them can actually softlock the game, preventing the player from being able to beat it. First, there's the quest where the Sherwood community has fallen ill with a mysterious ailment. Robin is tasked with obtaining mystical healing water from a pond guarded by Zora-like fishmen? what's going on here? Let's talk about the major quests which can lock the game and keep you from saving Marion from the sheriff's clutches. One of the Sherwood quests has Robin investigating a poisoned well. Okay, that makes sense. So far, so good. And it turns out that the well was poisoned by Mortiana, the sheriff's confidant. Fine. Okay, still within reason. But she's guarded by the reanimated skeleton of a giant? What? I mean, the movie did say that Mortiana was a witch, but left her so-called abilities rather ambiguous. Straight up having her control a reanimated skeleton is just a little jarring. But here's the thing. The player can't defeat the skeleton when it is first encountered. The game pushes the player away, saying the skeleton's magic is too strong and that a special weapon is needed. Here is where the problem with this quest comes in. After escaping back to the Sherwood Sanctuary, the next quest entails meeting Marion at a chapel where she gives Robin a druid dagger. Okay, that's keeping in line with the movie, so that works. The thing is, the druid dagger is the only thing that can defeat the giant's skeleton, who just happens to be guarding the sheriff at the end of the game. The druid dagger looks like any of the myriad other daggers encountered throughout the game and can be discarded. Once discarded, it cannot be picked up again. If the player does discard it, there's no way to defeat the giant skeleton and therefore no way to actually finish the game. For this playthrough, I made sure to keep all of the weapons gathered, just to be safe and make sure I could actually play through to completion. So where did these weird supernatural quests come from? Why are they part of a movie tie-in game that is otherwise relatively grounded in reality? The answer may be found in the Hardcore Gaming 101 article on the game. As stated in the article, while the game was always intended to be a Robin Hood game, it didn't start out life as Robin Hood Prince of Thieves. Instead, it was initially developed as the Legend of Robin Hood, with a brighter color palette, meters for food and water levels for each character, and the ability to steal from any NPC the player encounters. Oh, also, remember that archery contest that was omitted from Prince of Thieves mentioned earlier? It looks like it was also a part of the Legend of Robin Hood. So, because of this transition from the original Robin Hood game to the licensed version, while it is not documented in the article, it is entirely possible that the supernatural elements are actually remnants of the game that Prince of Thieves was originally intended to be. It also possibly explains why the game was able to be completed so quickly. It was already in development and just needed to be reworked to accommodate the movie license. Speaking of the movie license, there's a quirk with the license overall. You may have noticed that while the game carries the overall vibe of the film, the character portraits are slightly off. They actually swapped the character portraits for Guy of Gisborne and the sheriff in the side-scrolling portion of the game. And I mean, Christian Slater's Will Scarlet isn't even there, and his subplot with Robin was a big deal in the film. The reason for the character portraits being different than their film counterparts was revealed by Tomm Hulett on Twitter a little while ago. Yes, that Tomm Hulett. Some mighty fine games there. It turns out Prince of Thieves was the first game that Hulett ever worked on, and he pointed out that while the developers had the license for the film, they were not able to get the licenses for any of the actors in the film. It's kind of like how LJN got the MLB license for their Major League Baseball NES game, but didn't have the MLB PA license. All the teams are present, but none of the players. Something they actually got sued over for false advertising. To be fair, some of the character portraits are still pretty close approximations of the actors in the film, while still being different enough to avoid likeness infringement. Others, however, well, you tell me. Does this portrait look like this guy? All told, Robin Hood Prince of Thieves is a worthy standard bearer for the movie it represents. The overall combination of gameplay styles and the fact it was already in development before being turned into a licensed game means that there is a level of polish and a uniqueness to the experience that is absent in many other licensed games from the NES era. It is also a relatively short experience. The playthrough for this video clocked in at just over 3 hours, only slightly longer than the film it is based on. All of these elements outweigh the quirks in the game to make it a less discussed gem in the NES library, and therefore, a good weekend rental.
The evil, insatiable, terrifying horde!